back. So there is Johnny Cash's Long Black Veil. Before I get into a little bit of bio here, guys, thoughts on Johnny Cash's Long Black Veil as opposed to the band's Long Black Veil?
Well, Johnny Cash's is
Don't all jump at once.
far superior, in my opinion.
Matt,
I
take?
like yeah, Johnny Cash's is probably the definitive version, but I still like the band's. But yeah, I would say this is a better version.
Fair enough. So we are covering, I don't think I even said it, we're covering Live from Folsom Prison, which is actually going to be the only Johnny Cash album that's going to show up on the Best Ever Albums countdowns in any decade, and probably is Johnny Cash's most well-known album. There's sort of two different ways to attack Johnny Cash. One is his very interesting bio, which for anyone who's seen Walk the Line, I really don't want to. I would urge you to skip ahead maybe 5 minutes because pretty much all of the general bio for Johnny Cash will look very similar to the movie that you watched. It's a great film if you haven't watched it with Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon. I believe, Josh, you're the movie guy, but I believe Joaquin Phoenix won an Oscar, right?
Well, Reese did. I believe he
Okay.
did. I'll
Okay.
check that while you're talking.
We'll have to check that. So, and then there's also a little bit of an interesting background on this album itself, which would not have been covered in Walk the Line. So you can sort of fast forward to exactly where that point is. But here's the basics on Johnny Cash. He was born in 1932 in Arkansas, and for those that have always been curious, he sings in a bass baritone voice. So, origin story, he was a singer from early on. He was actually a tenor before puberty hit, and then he moved into being a bass baritone singer. He has a total of 90 million plus records sold worldwide, making him one of the 20 highest selling artists of all time, which I obviously Johnny Cash is well known worldwide, but I don't know if I would have ever thought of him as being a top 20 selling artist of all time, but he definitely is. He's the
Did
only
you say
member.
90 million?
90 million
90.
albums
Jeez,
worldwide.
wow.
Yes, exactly. And he's a member of the Country, Rock and Roll, and Gospel Halls of Fame. I'm going to give myself some cleaning the stacks for next week. I don't know how many other people are in all three of those Halls of Fame.
He's got to be the
but
only one.
I mean, if not, the only other person I could think
Elvis?
of. I was going to say the only other person I could think of is maybe Elvis, yeah, something like that. But I'll look into that, and who knows? There might be like a country singer too that we're not thinking of who has different stuff. But so Johnny Cash, he actually grew up in a colony in Arkansas, like a sort of like what you would think of as like a suburb down the road, but this was more like a rural version of it. It was a colony, and it was tied to the New Deal. And basically, what happened was families were given a plot of land to work on with the idea that they worked on it for a certain amount of time, they would own it later. And this was kind of Johnny Cash's background growing up. And he said that sort of that way of coming up always made him very familiar with songs of and the plight of both the poor and the working class, since that was most of the people in this colony. And if you listen to Johnny Cash quite a bit, you know that his most common themes are the working class, working man, sort of outlaw themes, death, and to some degree redemption and religion. Those are kind of, he does songs that are outside of that, but quite a bit of his catalog covers those things. So that kind of covers a little bit of why he might write about the poor and working class so much. Cash's brother, if you've ever seen Walk the Line, had a pretty awful death. He was, I guess there's almost no better way to put it than he was almost sawed in half in a farming accident. He managed to survive the accident, but a week later he died. So we talked about one of the themes being the poor and working class. Cash says that many of the themes of death and darkness in his songs comes from his lifelong grief from his brother's death, which he actually witnessed live. I don't mean to jump too far forward, but outside of that, Johnny Cash lived a pretty straightforward rural life. He did enlist in the Air Force in 1950, and he stayed in the Air Force until 1954. He was honorably discharged. He worked actually as a Morse code interceptor. And a fun fact, he was actually the first person in the Western world who was aware of Joseph Stalin's death. He received the initial telegraph from the East. So that's kind of a little fun fact right there.
That is a very
Nice.
interesting
Nice
fun
trivia.
fact.
Yeah, a little piece of trivia right there. So thank you three. It actually comes up quite a bit in the research. I'm pretty sure it was in the Wikipedia account, but also in some Johnny Cash bios that I read this week. It was around this point that Cash also married his first wife, Vivian. He would be married twice, I think most famously to June Carter later, but he was married to his first wife for quite a while as well. They moved together to Memphis. He was working a couple different gigs during the day. And then at night he was playing music, and he was playing. It was him. It was him and the Tennessee Two, which was Marshall Grant on bass and Luther Perkins on guitar. So he's making music, kind of as a hobby, but he always sort of saw it as something he would like to make into his vocation. So he walks into Sun Records, and we really haven't talked about Sun Records at all, but Sun Records was a really big freaking deal in the 1950s. I don't know how familiar you guys are with who was on Sun Records, but Matt or Josh, are you guys familiar with some of the other acts that were on Sun Records?
Well, Elvis, most
Elvis,
famously.
yep, most notably.
That's the one. I'm sure the other ones will come to me, but nothing's popping up right now.
Jerry Lee Lewis would be another pretty huge act that was on Sun Records, and pretty much all of the stars of country of that era were on Sun Records. So he walks into Sun Records where there's an argument to be made that it was the largest record label in the entire country at that point, and he walks on into the office on a whim, and at this point he was singing almost entirely gospel songs. So he auditions with gospel songs, and the label's head says that he didn't really want to record gospel anymore because he'd gotten a taste of Elvis and early Jerry Lee Lewis, and rock and roll / country's the future, right? And gospel wasn't selling the number of albums. There's a line ascribed to the record label head, where he said, "Go home and sin, then come back with a song I can sell," but that is actually not a true quote. It was made up as part of the sort of the mythology, I think, of Johnny Cash, and Johnny Cash himself on many occasions said that did not actually happen. But you will hear that a lot of different times on stuff that's not as well researched. So anyway, he goes back later that year, not discouraged, with some other songs he's written that apparently fill what they're looking for. They have more of that combination. There's certainly gospel elements to it, but has country and even a little bit of rock and roll type of sound to them as well. And he records his first album. So it's his second album in 1957 is Folsom Prison Blues, not to be confused with this album. That was actually a studio album, Folsom Prison Blues. And it was around that time in 1957 that Johnny Cash wanted and expressed the idea of wanting to do a concert in a prison, and it was not until 1968 where it came to fruition. So it was actually an idea he had 11 years earlier. He had actually been inspired to write the Folsom Prison Blues album in 1957 due to having read a book in 1953 about Folsom Prison. So this goes back quite a bit. He wrote the song in 1955. He read a book in 1953. It was called Inside the Walls of Folsom Prison by a gentleman by the name of Crane Wilbers, and that caused him to want to write a song about it. So this was kind of like a long journey of something that he was interested in. It's important to note that during this time, Johnny Cash had moved to number 3 on that Sun Records label. Elvis leaves the Sun Records label in late 1956, and they decide to put their biggest promotion behind Jerry Lee Lewis. And that's a little bit of a sticking point for Johnny Cash, although there is recordings of a time where Elvis dropped by the studio where Jerry Lee Lewis as well as Carl Perkins and Johnny Cash were all there, and they just sort of informally jammed out for an hour and a half, which I'm sure would have been fascinating to listen to. So I'm going to see if I can find any evidence of that in the YouTube world or anywhere, and try to put that up on our Twitter account as well to hear what that sounds like. So that would have been quite the mid-50s quartet there. So he leaves Sun Records in 1957 because he's upset he can't record any gospel songs. He doesn't think he's being promoted as well as somebody like Jerry Lee Lewis, and his royalty rate of 3% was less than the average of 5% for most artists. He signs with Columbia Records, surprise, surprise, considering how many people have ended there that we've covered, in 1958. but he had actually left and sort of had to give up the rights to some of his material with Sun Records. So while he was creating new studio albums on Columbia Records, they were releasing simultaneous albums all the way through 1964. So Johnny Cash was sort of releasing new material on two different record labels at the same time for a 6 year period, which makes him somewhat unique in music history.
I'm surprised that anybody allowed him to do that. That there weren't lawsuits or whatever preventing him from doing that.
I think back then those record deals, you know what I mean, were notoriously predatory, and so I think to get out of the record contract, I think at times you just had to leave some of your material behind. So from my reading, that was a little bit of what happened. It was in the early 1960s. He begins touring with the Carter family, which is three sisters. It includes his future wife June. He also becomes severely addicted to amphetamines and barbiturates during this time, which he originally used to stay awake during his tours. Unfortunately, he would battle those dual addictions for the rest of his life, with periods of sobriety mixed with pretty public relapses along the way. So it would be, unfortunately from that time on until his death in the early 2000s, he would struggle with substance abuse issues. However, despite having those two addictions, he was still selling a ton of records. However, he had a pretty infamous incident where he nearly died in a camper fire in the mid-60s. The fire actually ended up destroying 508 acres of California forest, and actually killed quite a few California condors that were already extinct. So Johnny Cash was pretty much almost responsible for the extinction of the California condor by killing off the vast majority of them due to this fire. He was pretty much unrepentant about it as well. It's an interesting story. I won't go into too much, or maybe I will in cleaning the stacks next week, but.
What's his defense? That they shouldn't have been there anyway. It was their fault.
It was sort of like a line where, the fire did it, not me. But it seems like what it was he fell asleep. He fell asleep while under sort of the substances, right? And he unfortunately ended up not turning off a stove, and then the stove burned stuff down. So but it was around this time, in the throes of drug addiction in the mid-60s, that he has a spiritual epiphany while contemplating suicide. And then June Carter agrees to marry him if he gets clean, so she moves into his mansion and helps him to get clean for what ended up being, depending on who you ask, the beginning of an 8-year period of sobriety, or a mostly sober period of time in his life. By all accounts, he dials it down a little bit, and in the late 60s and the early 70s, he's at amongst his most clean periods. So he was not there quite yet, though, at Folsom County Prison. He was starting the road to recovery, but still struggling with the addiction a little bit. So as this was being recorded, he still was in the throes of addiction a little bit. He also had found religion during this time, so a lot more of his songs began to take on a religious overtone. So that's a little bit of bio on Johnny Cash, who's one of the biggest figures in North American music, so I wanted to give him a full biography right there. Folsom County Prison, the live album, was released in May 1968. However, it was recorded 4 months earlier on January 13th, 1968. The album is 15 tracks. There were two shows the day that the album was recovered. 15 of the tracks were recorded during the first show, and actually 2 of the tracks were from the second show. So it is an amalgamation of 2 shows, however, it is primarily the first show. And the earliest tracks are the ones from the first show, and the later tracks are the ones from the second show. In case you're wondering. And I mentioned that this had been a long-held idea. The idea of doing the 2 shows was if the first performance wasn't good, they would have a second one to sort of mix and match between them, or just use the second one. And but it ended up going really well, especially the banter and the tracks themselves ended up really kind of giving this album a life of its own, and it was very well received critically, pretty much universally at the time. And so, I think that's going to be where I'm going to stop, because I want to talk about this album a little bit. Matt, let's start with you. What did you think?
This is a classic. I mean, absolute classic. Johnny Cash, I remember growing up, and I always knew about Johnny Cash, knew his voice, knew about his voice. But it was always kind of like, to me, he was always, known as a country singer, and I didn't like, country music, or at least what was presented to me as country music where I grew up, which was essentially, the radio, like the Nashville pop country, like Garth Brooks and stuff like that, which I didn't really care for. So I always kind of thought Johnny Cash was a little bit of a whatever, it's country, just threw it to the side. But a friend of mine got this record, and I was surprised that he had it. I was like, wow, you listen to this? And then he played it, and I was like, what the hell? This is awesome. Like it was totally not what I was expecting. And in the years later, I got it on my own, and I love this record. It is for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, first and foremost, the music, right? This is kind of like, the Americana country. It's rock. It's rockabilly. There's some great ballads on here, and the production is pretty good too for a live show. In a prison, it sounds pretty good, right? And I don't know if that's just the way that it was done originally, or if it's gotten because everything from the 60s essentially is re-released, and they're digitizing it or whatever. So, but this version, at least I was listening to on Spotify, and the CD that I had, they sound great. And then, like you mentioned, John, the banter, and I've found it very interesting to listen to this more intently this last week, and just kind of notice, how he's really playing off of the crowd of the inmates, and almost taking the side of the inmates versus the guards and stuff like that, because there's, he's kind of, he makes a couple of comments that seems like, he's a little bit more on their side, and that's kind of cool, right? He's showing them that, not that he's one of them, but he
doesn't think he's better than them.
Yeah, he's sympathetic, right? And it's just kind of cool. And it's interesting too, because you also have announcements that are made, like they're going to stop the show because some guards got to come out and you're wanted in reception. You need to go. So that's funny. But no, this sounds great. A lot of the songs are all, it looks like a lot of them are covers, but they're all most of them are centered around actually being incarcerated, right? So he's also singing songs that very much can relate to these guys. So it's like and plus who does concerts in prisons? Like we haven't really talked about that, and I'm interested to hear more about like the genesis of this idea, because it's very cool. These are groups of people that, probably, that society shuns and they want nothing to do with, and he went and did a show for them, and then he made this fantastic record. And nobody does that, right? So this is not just a classic album in terms of the music, but just the historical context in which it was produced, and this is the basis for me of a lot of the Americana music that I like. It's all entwined in here, and his voice is fantastic. It's almost too good, because it's like I feel bad. I want to sing along to some songs and I can't, because I can't get that low. So I just have to, I don't know, go up a register
bass
or
baritone?
just fake it. Yeah, that's not me. I was more of some baritone, some tenor, definitely not bass, but 5 stars, perfect album. This is great stuff.
Gotcha. Josh, how about you?
Before I get to my thoughts, I did confirm that Joaquin was only nominated for Walk the Line. He did not win Best Actor that year. He lost to Philip Seymour Hoffman in Capote.
Okay.
So,
gotcha. Not a bad choice.
And I did bring up some FOLSOM facts too, if you want some facts about the prison itself, or I can save that for cleaning the stacks.
Save it for cleaning the stacks. It is in California, for those wondering. Yeah. Yes.
Anyway, this is how you do a live album, right? The setting is so key to the experience of listening to this album. Like Matt said, it really captures the feeling of being there, and kind of the life of the prisoners to a certain extent, at least not during their recreational time. They're obviously excited and happy that he's there, and you get the feeling that they're really feeling the songs, right? And responding to when he picks up a new song, or like when June comes out, or like when he's bantering, like Matt said, with them, or asking for water and wondering if this water's good or not. I thought that was funny. And then
Yellow water, correct? How
yeah,
do you drink this yellow water?
yeah, this run off his boot, I think he said.
Yeah.
Tastes like it ran off Luther's boot.
Yeah. And this is almost, I made this notes, this is almost like a concept album, right? Because like Matt said, a lot of these songs are about being, in prison, or like Cocaine Blues,
Being an
or on
outlaw.
the run. Yeah,
Yeah, hard living.
25 minutes to go is about, being hanged. And
Yeah. And written by Shel Silverstein, by the way, I'd like to point out.
Oh,
which
really?
Is a fun
Poet?
fact, yes.
The kid's poet? Or poet?
You got it.
The
That's
Giving
interesting.
Tree, it is not.
No.
No. It's a fantastic freaking song lyrically, though.
Yeah, that's a great song. But yeah, it's almost like a prisoner is writing a song or something, about all these different experiences he had. Or that, another example is The Wall, about knowing a prisoner that was trying to get over the wall or wanted to escape. So it's just great, and the album really flows well, and it's got a nice sense of humor. Like when he says he's going to do some ballads and stuff, it's then funny ones like Dirty Old Egg-Sucking Dog and Flushed from the Bathroom of Your Heart, which are hilarious lyrically. And the prisoners are really surprised when he sings Dirty Old Egg-Sucking Dog and finally brings up the dog, that it's about a dog. And I really like when June Carter comes out. I think that takes it to another level because she's got such a great voice, and I love her just energy that she brings to singing. I wish she was. I wish she was on more songs. I think she's on a couple more in like backing vocals, but she doesn't sing like duet with him like that. That I wish she had done more of. And then it was the nice capper of ending the song written by one of the inmates, which was a really great song actually.
Yeah, it really was.
And it's impressive that he, I guess, developed that, the night before, after, or the music for it, I should say. But yeah, I mean, you can't go wrong with this album. I can't think of any better live album off the top of my head that's as good as this. This is kind of the standard for that sort of thing. I mean, this is only our second live album, but can you guys think of any other live albums that are as good as this? Or as a unique a setting? Yeah. Just, well, I guess unplugged, like Nirvana Unplugged or something, but that's not really
right.
Something like that.
That's a good question. I'm off the.
We'll have to mull that over.
I have to think
unique
about that.
settings. There's like Pink Floyd The Wall. You know what I mean? Which at the one that was actually at the Wall, right, was kind of a unique setting, and that was live. But yeah, we'll have to think about that one. I think there's some live albums I can think of that I enjoy. Maybe Kiss Alive. That was a pretty famous live album.
Nice.
Frampton Comes Alive was a pretty famous. Although I don't know any of the songs off of it, I just know that was. I remember my uncle saying everybody had that record. Everybody.
Yep.
So.
And they did. Well, we'll get back to that. That's actually a great question. Now, my take on everything that you guys said is totally applicable. The music is very simple and can be samey, but not in a bad way. It's just it's a very pleasant sound. The lyrics to all the songs are fantastic. We mentioned 25 Minutes to Go, but Cocaine Blues, where his voice cracks halfway through as he's singing, because he's just singing his guts out, but it's also about basically the perils of using cocaine. It's like a perfect way to sing the song, with like a frantic way of singing about being on cocaine, that where his voice cracks, it actually fits a song that would be about being frantically on cocaine. And side one ends with The Long Black Veil, which we talked about, which is basically about taking a secret to your death, which was cheating on your best friend's wife. And then the June Carter songs come halfway through side two. There's one point where he literally introduces that he's going to sing some ballads now and sit down, which I thought was funny, and you get prepared for the ballads. So the album is in segments as well, and I think the last song that was from The Inmate was Greystone Chapel, and that was a pretty fantastic song, and the writer Glenn Shirley actually ended up becoming a country singer himself when he was released from prison. So
nice.
Yep, which is another thing. But yeah, it's just that Perkins, his music mate, Carl Perkins, just his guitar is just very straightforward. I don't want to say two-step, but it's that 4-string guitar.
It's like a shuffle. It's like a shuffle.
You got it, like a shuffle sound, and and Johnny Cash's voice is like two instruments all in one. And the production by Bob Johnston, who we've talked about quite a
Oh
bit.
yeah, right.
Yep, he was the producer.
CTS legend.
You got it, CTS legend Bob Johnston. So you talked about the production, Matt. It was Mr.
Mm.
Johnston at the helm there. So yeah, this is one you got to listen to if you haven't heard it before, even if you don't love country music or maybe you don't listen to old albums and stuff. This is one of the ones you should dig back into the stacks for. It's pretty great, and it's hard to imagine the people that like music wouldn't like this one.
Yeah, and
So
it's timeless. Like I think that most this is one of those things that I think that most people would like. There's not I don't know. There's not much not to like here. I also think it's interesting. I listened yesterday at the end of the album after Greystone Chapel, that Glenn Shirley song. The audio sticks in there for like another announcement, and then it stays with the crowd. And you listen
as they're
to the
dispersing.
crowd.
Yep.
Yes. And you listen to them go back. And I never really thought about that or noticed it before, but it's like I just pictured that, right? Like these guys, they have nothing going on, like, you know what I mean? They're in prison, So
Right.
and they finally they witness this historic concert, like this fantastic concert by an amazing artist. And now they're just going to go back off to do their chores, or they're going back to their cells, or they're going to go back to jail for 10, 20, 30 years, and you just hear
Right.
that noise fade out. And I thought I'm sure that was done on purpose, and I think that it was pretty powerful, a pretty powerful, not image because you're not seeing it, but a pretty powerful sound effect that you got there.
Well, it makes them. I mean, they're a part of the album forever, right? And so that's their legacy in some respects too, is being a part of this. So maybe it's a little bit paying tribute to them, and just capturing the feel of being there too.
Yeah. John, was
Yeah,
there
but-
any I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say tracks that you want to check out: Folsom Prison Blues at the one spot, Cocaine Blues in 25 Minutes to Go at 4 and 5, Long Black Veil at 7. I think Dirty Old Egg Sucking Dog is a great, great placement in terms of where he puts it to kind of get the crowd back up. Send a Picture of My Mother is also a really good track that I think is like sort of a gem to start side 2, and then of course all the stuff with June Carter, Give My Love to Rose in particular, and we talked about Greystone Chapel to end, but there really aren't any misses on this.
No.
And none of the
No,
tracks
not
are
really.
more than about 3 minutes and 30 seconds, with the exception of the last track, which does run about 5 minutes and 34 seconds. So lots of good songs. We talked about the themes, and they're all covered in this. Yeah. So what were you going to say, Matt?
I'll get to that in a second, but I thought that Dark as the Dungeon was good too, because there's a part in that where he gets tripped up a little bit. He kind of screws up, and he tries to come, and he makes a comment like, don't laugh, or don't make a sound because they're recording it. And then the crowd starts to get in, like cheer on, and then the band kicks it into a different level, so you can hear it gets louder, it gets more intense, I guess, and it's a cool effect. It's like a cool part of the song that I don't think that they would have done if the crowd hadn't been egging them on like that.
He gets he says like no laughing during the song or something like that, if I remember correctly. Is that also the song where he says you can't say hell or shit or anything like that as well, which also
in
makes
between,
me laugh.
he's like, sorry about that, but you can't, we're recording an album here for Columbia, and you can't say hell or shit. And they bleep out shit on the Spotify version for some strange reason. I don't know why, but but the thing that I was going to ask is, at the time or at any point, John, was there anything that you came across about this being controversial, that he's going to perform this show for criminals, essentially? Right?
There really isn't. No, because he was so, I think, tied into that Man in Black image by this point in the outlaw stuff that it was just sort of seen as like, for those that viewed it as a gimmick, it was a gimmick that totally made sense. And no, I don't think. I mean. The only thing you heard was, obviously I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die. Shortly after this was released, there was, Robert Kennedy was assassinated and stuff, so it didn't get play at times during 1968 because it was seen as being glorifying violence. But that's about the only controversy you really ever read about this album, at least in terms of my research. I think it's just sort of, when you know what Johnny Cash writes about and sort of the idea, it makes sense that he would, sing some of these songs to people in prison. So
yeah. The other thing I will say too is, I just as I was clicking around, you know how old Johnny Cash was when he died?
No.
71. If you see pictures of him in his latter years, he looks like he's pushing 95. He
It's like
looks
Methuselah,
terrible.
yeah.
Oh my God,
He
I
lived a
couldn't.
hard life.
71. I would. Yeah, yeah.
Well, he did lead. I mean, he did lead a hard life. that's
He
definitely
certainly did, and it showed.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is great. And the other thing that I saw when I was coming up, because I guess Luther Perkins, which I was trying to figure out if Luther Perkins and Carl Perkins were related, if they were actually like brothers or something. And I didn't see that in my cursory overview, but I did see that Luther Perkins died later that year after falling asleep with a lit cigarette in his hand. And the place caught on fire. So I guess Johnny Cash and members of his band had issues with setting fires absent-mindedly, but yeah.
And I saw nothing about Luther and Carl being related, so it just could be there were many Perkinses along the way. Yes. So, but if anybody knows any different, just let me know. And as we've mentioned before when we covered Nashville Skyline, this is our second time with Johnny Cash because he does sing the opening track with Bob Dylan.
Oh, right.
Earlier a little later in 1969 after this album comes back. And Perkins was also on that album, if you remember, as well. So there you go.